Hi, I'm Mark Juergensmeyer from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and this is another and a really interesting series, a webinar series on Sikh studies, just kind of testing the state of the field throughout North America and the UK. And this is a project that was conceived by a dear friend of mine, Narendra Singh Kapani, who was the founder of the Sikh Foundation. And shortly before his untimely death, just a few weeks ago, he called me up and asked if I wouldn't moderate this series because some 45 years ago, he and I had established the first ever conference on Sikh studies in North America. It was a kind of groundbreaking moment which brought together people in the field of Sikh studies from all over to basically assess the state of the field. Then Narendra said the time has come to do that again. But in an age of COVID and pandemic, we have to do that online, and we'll do that through Zoom. So instead of having a single conference where we bring everybody together, in some ways we do something more interesting. We go to them. So we've been going from place to place to talk with people about the different ways in which Sikh studies is conceived and done. And they're not all the same. I mean, there are big departments that have endowed chairs and their programs and their centers. And then there are other locations that are different. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Our guest today is Michael Hawley, a good friend and a great stalwart in the field of Sikh studies, who is in an interesting situation. So Michael, tell me about your academic setting, and then we're going to launch into some really exciting work that you're doing on Sikh history in Canada, and that's the breaking news we want to hear about. But first of all, tell people about where you are and what's going on.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Sikh Foundation for this opportunity to sit and talk about stuff that I actually really like doing, and where you don't have to sit there and take notes like my students at all. We can just sit and we can talk about things. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I teach at Mount Royal University. It is a small to medium-sized liberal arts undergraduate university in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And for those of your listeners who don't know where Calgary or Alberta is, it's probably you'll know where British Columbia and Alberta is. Move a little to the right on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, and that's where Alberta is.
Near one of the most beautiful spots on the planet, Banff National Park.
It was absolutely beautiful. If you liked -40 last week, so beautiful from inside looking out. Yeah, so that's where I am. Because we are a fairly small university, we actually do not have a major in religious studies. As a matter of fact, we only have a minor degree in religious studies. It's a very small contingent of faculty. I think I'm the only person around for literally miles who works in the area of Sikh studies. So I kind of feel sometimes like I'm a little bit geographically in the wilderness a little bit, but because of technology and Zoom and this sort of thing, I feel very, very connected with a lot of other scholars. So,
well, and today you're connected with a whole bunch of people who are interested in what you do and who are really proud of what you do and are delighted that you are an outpost for Sikh studies in Calgary.
Yeah.
So tell about this really interesting project on Sikh history in the region.
Yeah, this is something that I've been working on actually for probably about the past 3 or 4 years full time. It's I've sort of put it under the umbrella title of the Alberta Sikh History Project. And what it's really designed to do is to look at and to document actually for the first time Sikh history and Sikh migration in the province. So much of Sikh history in Canada, much like Sikh history in the United States, I would imagine, is focused on the West Coast, in California, maybe a little bit in Oregon and Washington. In Canada, it's very much focused in Vancouver. But because we're sort of right next door, I thought, what about Sikhs here? What's the history here? And I began looking around to see what had been written, what had been documented, and there really wasn't a lot that was written. There were a few short articles by scholars that were written reasonably recently, and there was some really quite dated material with a couple of interviews with Sikh pioneers here. And if you read that material, you kind of came away with the impression that, there were maybe two families of Sikhs here in the province before 1950, and that was it. I have a little bit of a background in history, and that just didn't sit right with me. The sort of the historical hairs on the back of my neck kind of stood up, and I thought, that just doesn't make sense. So I started looking around and searching through archives, searching through border crossing records, marriage certificates, these sorts of things. And within probably about 6 months, I had, I'm sure, nearly 400 documents of Sikhs in the province prior to 1950.
Wow.
And
So when did the first ones come? They came from the Punjab, I assume.
Probably from the Punjab, and this is part of the puzzle that we're working through, is we don't have a lot of information as to when or how these folks came, because of course we can't connect them necessarily with specific passengers lists, and they appear in the archive and sometimes disappear just as quickly. But the first ones came, the first documented ones that we have are photographs that date from 1903. Now, when we think about that for a minute, I mean, that's almost comparable to what's happening in Vancouver.
Yeah.
So we have a very, very long and actually a fairly rich history, though our numbers are much smaller in Alberta than they would be in British Columbia. But there's been a Sikh presence here for well over 100 years. As a matter of fact, there's been Sikhs in Alberta since Alberta was Alberta. Alberta became a province in 1905.
Wow.
So there have been Sikhs here right from the very beginning. And so for the past maybe 3-4 years, myself and a number of different research assistants have been combing through archives, everything from sort of provincial archives for vital statistics, passengers lists, ledgers, voters lists, but also we've been searching through every single issue of every single newspaper ever published in Alberta and pulling out any references or reporting or representations about Sikhs in the province. And I think I just had to do a quick count just back in January last month, and I think we have about 20,000 documents to work through now. So there's something really kind of cool here. There's something really fascinating happening, and it hasn't been written about yet.
Wow.
And so this, to me, I think this is really neat and really exciting.
Well, that's really impressive. 20,000 documents. That's
20,000 documents.
And you said are there other people working with you on this project?
It's sort of being led by myself, but there are a number of research assistants that I have had sort of on a contract basis that have done a lot of the database searches for newspaper articles and that sort of thing.
So I'm sure you've talked with the local Sikh community in Calgary.
Absolutely.
And do any of them have any memory of this? Are they descendants of these early ancestors? Any of them, or is there a break between the earlier and the present communities?
Yeah, there's a couple instances of descendants of the very, very first pioneers who came to Alberta. And yes, I have spoken with several of them. In some cases, grandchildren, and sometimes great-great-grandchildren, who have been just so kind and open to talk about what they know about their family, in some cases to pass on their own private sort of personal archive, pictures, photographs, documentation, immigration papers, those sorts of things. So it's not just strictly archival work. It is very much, in a sense, quasi-ethnographic work with interviews with Sikh pioneers. And that is actually one of the interesting things I find about this project, is in many ways, it's my speaking with members of the Sikh community. And by the way, they're not just in Alberta. These families are spread out across the country and in other countries as well. In many cases, they're sort of directing where the research goes. They are in many ways, by their recommendations and by their experiences and by their own connections, are sort of laying the path and the trajectory of the research. So in some ways, this is a very sort of community-driven sort of project. And that I think is really important as well.
That's really interesting. Well, most of it, what I know about early Sikh history in the United States is in California,
Right.
and a pattern there were originally communities up in Vancouver who then came to Oregon and then came down to California. It joined with others who came directly from India about the same time in the around the beginning of the 20th century, and most of them went into farming, and of course, they were, Punjab farmers to begin with, so they knew how to irrigate, do all these kinds of things, which was so important in the San Joaquin Valley in California. But did you discover the same thing in Calgary? Were they basically farmers?
Well, yes and no. And in many ways, this is also one of the interesting things that's coming out of this research, is that while we do have some early pioneers who got into farming and ranching, some who came to work in the lumber mills and on the railroads.
Right.
We also have those who came as, surprisingly, entrepreneurs, shop owners, business owners. We have those who worked for Imperial Oil as laborers, but nonetheless in that sort of thing. Some working for hotels. Some becoming what were called market gardeners, where they would be sort of private gardeners who would sell to various local retail outlets rather than ranching or farming per se. So what this research is starting to show is it's really starting to change the narrative about how we think of Sikhs in the province. Because the fact that Sikhs were here as early as 1903 and maybe even before, it tells us that we should maybe rethink that idea of Sikhs simply as being migrants or immigrants, that they are in fact builders. They're builders of provinces, they're builders of states. They've been here since before the beginning. And they aren't just simply laborers, unskilled laborers.
Right.
And that's very often the narrative that gets promoted, right? They're innovative, they're industrious. They will get into a whole range of different occupations. So that
they did everything, just like Sikhs everywhere. They do everything.
No, absolutely. But it really kind of sort of unsettles that comfortable narrative about the idea that Sikhs came and became involved in railroads or lumber or farming, period. Right? It nuances the narrative a little bit more.
Now, Michael, I'm sure a lot of people have questions. And by the way, those of you who are watching this live, obviously it doesn't work with the recording. If you're watching it live and you have questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can ask questions, and then I'll be able to look at them in a few minutes after we've finished my conversation with Michael. And then we'll ask as many questions as we have time for. So if you have questions for Michael in this project, I sure have a lot more questions, but let's save them because there are other things I want to talk about. For example, what you're doing in terms of teaching. I noticed on the catalog of the university, of Mount Royal University, that you have two courses in Sikhism, which is as many or more than at major universities throughout the United States and UK. That's really amazing. So can you tell about those courses and who takes them? Are they mostly heritage students from Sikh
Right,
families,
right.
or
Yeah, we're kind of in an interesting spot, as you say, because we do have, and it seems sort of silly to say, two courses, which is um, at least equivalent to, if not more than a lot of other universities. And so that I think makes Mount Royal a little bit unique as well. As far as student demographics go, often I'm the only Gori in the room. I'm the only white guy in the room very often. It's mostly Punjabis who are taking the classes,
hmm,
which makes for a very, very interesting teaching dynamic.
Canadians from Punjabi background, right?
From Punjabi background, absolutely. And very often these are second or sometimes, in some cases, third generation
Right.
Canadians. Yeah. And so many Punjabis in the class all come in with different levels of knowledge about Sikhism, about Sikhi, about their own tradition.
Mhm.
But also, once we get a little bit further into these courses, they start to open up that they're interested in getting a little bit more of a scholarly or an academic view on their own tradition. Because very often they aren't taught from that perspective, certainly at home or in the Gurdwara. They're at home in Gurdwara are doing something else.
So
Um,
what do you teach? How are the courses structured? Like you have one that's, I think, just called Sikhism, or
yeah,
uh,
and that one is largely an overview of Sikh history, teachings, beliefs, practices, right from the time of Guru Nanak Dev Ji right up to the present. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour. It's really designed to be an overview to get people conversant a little bit in Sikh history. In that
you
course,
structure that historically, or thematically, or both?
yeah, it's actually both, and the structure will change from term to term. Sometimes it's first and foremost historically with sort of thematic tangents built into the course. So scripture, issues about gender when they come up, issues about self-sacrifice and martyrdom we may take detours into as we tell the historical narrative. In other cases, sometimes it's led off with history for the first half of the term, and then we do more of a thematic treatment for the second part of the term. So it really does vary.
And
One of
how many students you have usually?
the courses are fairly small, I guess, compared to other Canadian universities. They're probably about maybe 30 students they're capped at.
It's pretty good.
So it's not bad. The way that I teach these courses, though, is one of the requirements is to get students out of the classroom and into the communities, into the gurdwaras, and do that sort of hands-on, if you will, field work. Because as
So do you go on field trips? Do you go to the local Gurdwara?
I used to, but I do not take them anymore. And the reason why I don't take students anymore is because very often I found many of them, sometimes the Punjabi students would do this, but very often the non-Punjabis would look to me to kind of filter the information and to point out to them what is most important. And I didn't want that to happen.
Yeah.
We did a lot of preparation work so they knew what to expect when they went, and they could go with somebody else in the classroom or go as a group, but I wasn't going to be there to be the filter or the barrier between themselves and the experiences at the Gurdwara. And
But
it,
so you require them to go on their own.
yeah, yeah, outside of class time, simply because, well, you know as well as I do, inside the four walls of a classroom, that's sort of limited. You can't see it, hear it, right? The kirtan, so much importance within the Sikh
Right.
tradition. Langar, the smells, the
Right.
taste, the sounds. I mean, that whole embodied experience is so important.
I do the same thing in my classes. I take students to the Gurdwara, so
Yeah,
they can actually be there and they can talk to the grunty and they can talk with the members of the community.
yeah,
And then, of course, they're all bowled away with the langar.
of course,
The idea of free food is pretty appealing,
of course.
particularly to undergraduates.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's very interesting is, for those who have never been to a good bar before, they're very, very hesitant and very, very nervous about going. But on more than one occasion, I've seen former students at the Gurdwara revisiting on their own time. So something has caught, or something has taken, or an interest has been sparked there, which I think is
Well,
fantastic.
for one thing, invariably, the members of the community who are there in the Gurdwara are so welcoming and so generous with their time, and so easy easy to get along with, that the
Well, yeah,
students just immediately feel at home.
yeah, and it's not just with my students. I mean, that goes as well with the research that I'm doing, as well. That what I'm doing in the classroom and what I'm doing in my research simply wouldn't be possible without the generosity and the effort of the people I speak with in the various communities that I've been to. So
So what's the other course that you teach?
the other course is on Sikh Diaspora or Global Sikhism. So it's on Sikhs outside of Punjab or outside of India more broadly. And of course, there we have a lot more focus on Canada, United States, and the UK, though we do consider other contexts as well. So it's more of a global view of the Sikh tradition.
So on that, you look at different regions of the world to see like what the contribution that Sikhs have made and the history of their involvement and so forth.
Well, there is certainly that part about sort of migration and settlement and change and connection with Punjab. I mean, certainly that's part of it, but we also look at broader questions about belonging, about citizenship, about questions in Canada about multiculturalism and how well multiculturalism fits or doesn't fit with Sikh values. Um,
Right.
some of the obstacles that Sikhs have faced and have had to confront in different settings, but also the contributions and the way in which Sikhs have changed the places that they've moved to, because
Mhm.
that migration isn't a one-way street, right?
Right.
Just as much as Sikhs are affected, so too are various host communities. And I think that absolutely needs to be recognized as well.
Well, also, I think there are more Sikhs in the Canadian cabinet than in any other government in the world, right?
Yeah, well, I think our Prime Minister Trudeau got himself into a little bit of hot water for making a very similar comment about that, saying that he had more Sikhs in the cabinet than Modi. So,
It's true. So I'm really inspired by the courses you teach, but let me move on to another, because you talked briefly about Sikhs in Canada in general, and you're in Alberta, but do you have a connection with Sikh Studies across Canada, and can you kind of report on what's going on in Canada in general?
so sort of the Canadian scene for Sikh studies.
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly do have connections with several of the scholars who teach in the area of Sikh studies across the country. Um, I have very often invited other scholars in for what we had at Mount Royal was a Sikh Studies speaker series that invited experts from not only Canada, but also the United States in to come and
So
speak.
what are the other universities? I mean, if you're in Canada and you want to do Sikh studies and you don't want to go all the way to Alberta, what what are the other options?
There's actually a number of other options. I know that certainly one first go-to place would be probably the University of British Columbia, where there is a chair of, I think it's Punjabi language and Sikh studies. I believe that's the title of it.
Yeah.
Certainly, Sikh studies and Sikh courses on Sikhism are taught at, um, the University of the Fraser Valley, which is just outside of Vancouver in Abbotsford. Doris Jacobs teaches at the University of Waterloo. There's been courses being run through McGill University for decades now. But there's, I guess, new on the Canadian scene is, I just got word maybe a few months ago that there may be a new Sikh chair for Concordia University in Montreal. And I know also that the University of Calgary here in Calgary has also been talking about establishing a Sikh chair as well. So if those two chairs manage to get going, we're going to have a really robust scene here, and it's high time.
Well, we're going to have more Canadian reps in this series, but I just want to get, since you're the first,
Okay.
Canadian, I just want to get a brief
Right.
overview. I also understand you're involved with the American Academy of Religion and their attempts to do Sikh studies. Can you say a word about that?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. The story of my involvement with the AAR and Sikh Studies is kind of interesting because it came out of actually.
We should explain to people what the AAR
I'm
is.
sorry, the AAR is the American Academy of Religion, which is sort of the foremost venue for scholarship in religious studies, and they have an annual meeting each year, usually in the United States.
But not always. They've had in Montreal and Toronto.
They've had it in Montreal and Toronto as well, and I think those are the two exceptions, but largely in the U.S. My involvement with the AAR actually came out of probably largely selfish reasons, to tell you the truth. When I first started teaching courses on Sikhism back in, I think it was 2003, I came from a background actually in Hinduism, history of Hinduism in India. So my transition to Sikh studies was new. And one of the ways that I thought I could improve my knowledge and make connections with those in the field was to go to the AAR. And very quickly, and this is back in 2005, 2006, when I started thinking about doing this, I looked at the AAR list of program units, and it seems that AAR and Sikh Studies at the AAR was, like a very well-known scholar once said, the forgotten tradition. It just wasn't offered at the AAR. There was no Sikh Studies program unit at the AAR. And so I started contacting scholars that I knew and that I had read, that I had contributions to make and had made contributions to Sikh Studies. And I started simply emailing them out of the blue. I'd never met these people before, and said, are you interested in forming perhaps a group at the AAR? There's a gap here. It needs to be recognized. Sikhism needs to have that representation at this scholarly forum. And again, I'm so lucky to work with such great colleagues. Many of them agreed and said yes. In that first cohort back in, I think, 2007 is when we started this. Doris Jacobs, Robin Reinhardt, Shola Singh, Balbinder Bhogal, Arvind Mander, and I'm sure I'm missing a couple of people, and I apologize to them, but they were the ones that helped me bring this together. And we've been sort of growing that program unit since about 2007, 2008.
So now you have an established Sikh Studies group in the AAR, and you have panels every year?
Yep, we have panels every year, and sometimes we collaborate with other program units to get a little bit of interdisciplinary involvement and perspective on things, which is really neat. And it's been actually a really exciting thing to do at that sort of level. And it's really kind of put Sikh Studies, in a sense, on the map as far as the AAR is concerned.
So you just mentioned it briefly, but I'm sure people are curious to know how you got involved in the field of Sikh Studies, because I mean, a lot of people who are in the field were, born into a Punjabi family, and so it's kind of literally in their blood. And there are other people like me. I went to India and I ended up teaching at Punjab University, and felt the gracious and generosity of Sikhs, and the extremely interesting, fascinating aspects of the Sikh tradition. Was just drawn into it. And was that your experience? Did you go to India, or what happened? How did you get involved in Sikh studies?
To be perfectly honest, I backed my way into it. This was not well planned by any stretch of the imagination. I when I finished my PhD back in, I think, 2000, 2001, I think no sooner had the ink dried on my doctorate than I was asked by the chair, the then chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Calgary, would I be interested in teaching a course on the Sikhs and Sikhism?
And you didn't know anything about it at that time.
Well, I knew nothing about it, of course, because it wasn't taught at any university. I mean, I had done some reading around, and I had become acquainted with some of sort of modern, 20th century, 19th century Sikh history, but I had no background in this whatever. So, I mean, only a fool would say yes to that. So I said yes, and I spent
A fool or an assistant professor who wants to get tenured.
no, this was still contract person. This was I was still trying to make my way. So I read as much as I possibly could and put together a course that I look back on now and kind of go, ooh, that was not so great. But I put it together in 2003. And I think every term since then, I've taught that course. And every term except for one, the course has always been waitlisted. So there is a demand for it. And that one time that it wasn't waitlisted, it was an 8 o'clock in the morning class. So I'll sort of give that one a pass. What's interesting though about where that request to teach came from, it did come, of course, from the chair of the Religious Studies Department at the time, but he was requested by the Sikh community in Calgary. He had been approached by members of the Sikh community saying, this is something that, well, the way they couched it to me is, this is something that Punjabi youth and Sikh youth would really benefit from a more academic treatment of their own tradition. So the impulse behind that, my teaching, actually came from the Sikh community. And since that time, I've always sort of been trying to cultivate links, and I've garnered lots of friendships with many in the Sikh community over the past, what is it now, 18 years, time flies. So I've been working in the community in one way or another for about the past 18 years.
Well, as you quickly discovered, I'm sure the Sikhs love scholarship, and they love accurate scholarship about all aspects of life, including their own tradition.
Yep.
Just go to the Punjab and see all the Khalsa colleges, and you'll see how impressive the Sikh commitment to scholarship is. But how'd you learn about Sikhism? What did you just, like a undergraduate with a term paper? You just got a bunch of books out of the library and started?
It was a lot of hard reading and a lot of time spent with the scholarship at the time that was available. And again, this sort of ties into my looking to the AAR for possible sources, and there wasn't anything. So that's what I mean. It was sort of a little bit of a selfish motivation to get that going. But over the past, I guess, decade or so, I've been very, very fortunate enough to have very collegial, very open colleagues who have pointed me in the direction of really good scholarship, who have mentored me, have really sort of in many ways kind of brought me along to be able to do the work that I do in Sikh studies. And I'm very, very grateful for that.
So I assume you've been able to go back to India, and you've gone to Amritsar, and you've
and you know what, you would be right to perhaps assume that, but you would actually be incorrect. The last time I was in India was actually 1999. And
Wow.
I have a very kind of bittersweet story about that, because somewhere in my box of worldly treasures is an unused train ticket from Delhi to Amritsar for the tricentenary celebrations of the Khalsa Panth in 1999. I purchased a ticket to go.
Yeah.
Um, there were trouble with the trains that day. Things were running late. And by the time I would be able to get to Amritsar, it would have been about a day late. So I actually never was able to make the trip. But that's on my bucket list. And if anyone wishes to take me, I'll put my email in the chat.
Well, the next time I go, I'll have to check you in as accompanying baggage or something, because
There you go. But
yeah,
but in some ways that's also what inspired me to sort of take up the field that I'm in Sikh studies. I mean, I do not have sort of the traditional training, and I certainly don't have the language training in 16th century Gurmukhi and that sort of thing to be able to do that sort of work. So what I'm doing here is doing work in the Sikh diaspora, where most, not all, but certainly most of the source material is in English. And where I do need assistance with translation and that sort of thing, I do have a number of people who have offered to help and to translate and corroborate the way in which things have been translated. So I've been very, very fortunate as well.
so for your students who want to study Punjabi, is there any opportunity in Alberta?
Sadly, no, not at this time. I think they would need to be going to probably UBC is the place where it will be taught. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and in the Gurdwaras, so they have some sort of Punjabi class or something?
They all do have some form of Punjabi class, absolutely. Um, there's a number of different Gurdwara here in the city, and they all offer some that sort of Sunday school type of instruction. It's geared primarily for younger people, for school-age children, though there are occasionally classes for adults as well, and I've been sorely tempted to enroll in those classes.
Right.
Um, for my own doctorate, I ended up with Hindi and Sanskrit, so I should be able to pick up Punjabi fairly quickly.
You should. It's not the same as I've discovered. When I
Yeah.
tried to learn Punjabi on the basis of my Hindi, it is
No. But
definitely a different language.
yeah, oh no, no, absolutely. I'm not saying they're the same, but yeah.
So, Michael, we've got a bunch of questions. Let me turn to Pinderjeet as our first question. Who was with us this
Yeah.
last week, 2 weeks ago, and she said that your project is fascinating, and she wonders whether you have reached out to the community, particularly to the Gurdwaras, where they may have archives that might give you further information on the history of the Sikh community in Alberta. Has that been one of the things you've looked at?
Yeah, first of all, hi, Upinderjeet. Welcome, glad you made it. Yeah, and I have been working with, well, at least two of the Gurdwaras here that are sort of the most long established Gurdwaras, and been able to look through some of their records and have access to some of their sources. But that's sort of an ongoing process, and certainly in the past year with COVID, that the brakes have sort of been put on that sort of research.
But have you found those archives to be helpful?
To some degree, absolutely. What I have found actually more helpful is those who were members of the Gurdwara when it was first founded very often have their own records and their own papers that in many cases they were willing to share with me and talk about their experiences. So it's largely come through private archives and private records from people who were there at the time.
So while we're on the topic of the archives, Sonia Dami has a question. about your 20,000
Yeah.
documents. She's impressed as I am. And since Sonia does work on Sikh art, she's wondering about art, the representation of artists and artwork and visual representations, including pictures. So how much of what you've been able to discover um, include that? And she is also thinking of the work of the Canadian artist Kirat Kaur, and her portrait of Harnam Kaur as one of the earliest Punjabi women in Canada.
Mhm.
That,
Yeah.
are you familiar with that? Yeah.
Yeah, and the absolutely fantastic, fantastic question. Um, that question about art and images and whether it's painting or whether it's more other fine arts, that hasn't really come into the actual research and collection of data as yet. As I said, we've spent so much time looking at things that are found in provincial archives and newspaper databases and these sorts of things, because we've been focusing primarily on trying to get that early history documented. Um, Certainly there are representations of Sikhs, both self-representations as well as representations in the media of Sikhs that need to be brought into this project and need to be brought into this discussion, and they will be.
Yeah, because sometimes art gives that window into that historical narrative as well.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And that will also go for things such as drawings, editorial cartoons, those sorts of things will get drawn in.
But you have photographs. You have quite a few photographs, right?
We have many photographs, though unfortunately we do not have a lot of the pioneers themselves. I was speaking with one of my colleagues at the University of the Fraser Valley just yesterday, actually, Satwinder Banks, who's done some fantastic work in Abbotsford as well as in India. And sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
About photographs.
Oh, and she was, yes, thank you. And she was saying in British Columbia, they have the problem of way too many photographs, but they can't put names to the faces. And so they speak of sort of BC being kind of the nameless collective. In Alberta, we've got the reverse problem. We have names, but no images. So we're sort of the faceless collective here in Alberta, at least for the first part of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Once we start getting into, of course, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, then there's lots of images and lots of pictures. So there's challenges, absolute challenges to writing that early history without those sorts of images. Though we do have a few that families have contributed. So that's fantastic.
Great. So now changing the topic slightly, my colleague Pashara Singh from UC Riverside, who was our guest several weeks ago.
Hey, Prashara.
Yeah, Bashar is asking about the AR
Yes.
and your experiences in putting together the Sikh Studies group, which is, of course, very impressive because you were a pioneer in doing this. And so he wants to know, was it difficult? What'd you do? I know you talked about just contacting people out of the blue, but was it difficult to start this and get it going? And then I'm particularly interested in, because I've been associated with the AR, as you know, about a number of groups that start and then kind of sputter out.
Right.
Because it's one thing to start a group and it's another thing to keep the momentum going so that it takes on a life of its own.
Right.
So can you talk about both of those things? How, starting it and then building an infrastructure and a commitment that keeps it going.
Right, and I think Professor Singh actually raises a really good point. I think back when we first formed the group, there was a recognized need that this needs to be here at the AAR, that the American Academy of Religion, without Sikh representation, there's a hole, there's a gap there. Particularly given the long history and the long contributions of Sikhs in America and in North America. So I think there was the the will and the enthusiasm to put the group together. And the group has done reasonably well, I think, over the past, I guess now 12 years, 13 years since it was put together. There is a little bit of ebbing and flowing as far as participation goes. Some years participation is a little low. Sometimes there's lots of proposals and lots of interest. Some of that depends on what's going on in the world and what people are interested in writing on. But I think one of the biggest challenges that we have with Sikh Studies at the AAR is, of course, Sikh Studies is not restricted to religious studies. It's not simply something that is housed in religious studies. And I think this is something that is starting to change in some ways. Whereas Sikh Studies used to be very sort of historical, textual, this sort of thing, it's now much more than that. And so many of the people working and doing fantastic work in Sikh Studies come from history, for example, or English, or film, or education, or law, all these diverse disciplines. So the challenge that at least I have had with the AAR is being able to draw in and build that constituency from a number of different disciplinary locations, even though it is an annual meeting that focuses on that category of religion, and it's primarily targeted to religious studies folks. And
our position, our endowed chair at the University of California, Santa Barbara, our endowed chair in Sikh Studies, the Kundan Kaur Kapane chair, named that was granted by Narendra Kapane in honor of his mother, is based in the Department of Global Studies, for example.
Yeah.
And the current occupant, as we saw in our webinar, is a historian.
Yeah.
So what you say is quite true. I mean, people come to Sikh Studies for a variety of perspectives. Nirbakar Singh, who is the holder of the Sikh Studies chair at UC Santa Cruz, is an economist.
Yeah.
So, Sikh Studies can embrace a variety of disciplinary perspectives. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and Neith Kaur Hundal at UC Irvine is in anthropology. Arvind Singh Mandar is in broader cultural studies and teaches sort of more from a philosophical angle.
Right.
You have Francesca Cassio, who's in ethnomusicology, and it comes from all sorts of. So that's one of the big challenges, I think, for us at the AAR. But it's also really an opportunity that Sikh Studies provides to get us rethinking what is religion and how do we define what religion is. And in some ways, Sikh Studies begins to allow us to push some of those boundaries, which I think is really exciting.
Right. So back to the questions, we have someone who was asking about whether you have classes for Punjabi. You've already answered that. Alas, you don't. But UBC does, I think. So people would have to go over the mountains to get to Vancouver.
A beautiful trip.
It is a beautiful. I've taken it. Actually, I think we took the train. That's one of these special things because the train stop in Banff is one of these kind of Victorian era classics, and that's just one of the great trips in the world to go through the Rockies. Anyway, don't get me hung up on that. One of the most, as I said from the outset, you're near one of the most beautiful spots on the planet. You probably take it for granted, but you're really very lucky. Someone is asking about the development, the trajectory of the Sikh diaspora in Canada. Is it keeping up with the kind of global trends? How does it fit with the comparative diasporas in the US, UK, so forth? Is the community expanding, and is it like in California, it tends more to be technologically sophisticated people, less farmers, that sort of thing?
Right. Yeah, well, the Sikh diaspora in Canada is, I mean, it's incredibly diverse. It's incredibly nuanced, and it's very, very much engaged on all sorts of levels, whether it's um, writing their own history, being involved in sort of more academic initiatives, public history initiatives, those sorts of things. Those things are happening largely in Vancouver, where these histories and these voices and oral histories are being recorded on the West Coast. We have very, very active, politically active Sikhs here in Canada, as you might imagine. Both in terms of those who take more of an academic, scholarly approach, writing about Sikh issues, blogs about Sikh issues, to, of course, representation in Canadian politics. So it's very, very diverse, and it's one of the most dynamic, I think, Sikh diasporas that there is.
Yeah, Lou Fenich had a question about AKJ Sikhs.
Yeah.
Can you have any comment about that?
They are alive and well in Calgary. Yeah, they're absolutely are part of the fabric of the Calgary community. They seem to be, from what I know, they seem to be have some momentum to them that people are attracted, particularly youth being attracted to that sort of messaging, and some of the initiatives that they do as far as teaching and instruction and those sorts of things. So yeah, AKJ is very, very much part of the Alberta scene. Yeah.
So tell people who don't know what that means.
Akan Kirtani Jata Kirtan. Akan Kirtani Jata is a reasonably new Sikh organization that came about that preaches a particular view of Sikh practice. It has its own Rahit code, and certainly for Sikhs in Canada and Sikhs in Calgary, a number of different educational initiatives, teaching seminars, those sorts of things that are involved with that group.
So it's a kind of a revivalist movement within the Sikh community.
In some ways, yes, and it also takes on sort of that, very much so, that social activist. They're socially active within the community as well. Yeah.
Arkhand Kirtane Chata.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Lou. What would you like to see happening, in 5 or 10 years let's start with Calgary, where you are, and then, beyond that with Sikh Studies in Canada in general.
Right. I mean, the answer that I'm going to give is probably going to not surprise too many people. I would like to see it, Sikh Studies, really sort of grow in Canada, but set down more institutional roots in some ways. More universities teaching courses in Sikh Studies, but also connections between the universities and the communities. I think that's an important step to build networks and build knowledge. I don't think that the universities ought to sort of be siloed places of knowledge. So I think that sort of connection is very beneficial. I would like to see as well, and maybe this is my bias, Sikh history brought into the public school curriculum, for it to be taught alongside of all other histories as well, but not as an add-on, as an integral part of that history. Because as the work that I'm doing and the work that has been done in BC is showing, that Sikh history is also Canadian history. Those two are in many ways inseparable, and they're bound up. And certainly there's been some tremendous work done as far as recognizing Chinese in Canada, the Japanese internments in Canada. Wonderful stuff going on now with First Nations and Indigenous peoples. And certainly it's time for the Sikhs. It's time for the Sikhs to be included into that history that they have been really written out of, or just simply ignored. So I would really like to see that integrated into Canadian schools across the country.
Well, that's a wonderful vision. And Canada as a country, as a issue of national policy, has embraced multiculturalism, I think in a very respectful and honorable way, a way that the United States has been trying to catch up, and in its own way. I mean, particularly in California, I think we recognize it in a way that many other parts of the United States doesn't. But Canada really has shown the way in that regard, and I think you've taken the opportunity of developing the strength in multicultural studies to understand the Sikh community and to study it and to bring a kind of light, a light of Sikh studies in an area of the world that otherwise would not be as strong. So, Michael, I want to congratulate you on what you're doing. You're a real pioneer and a real innovator. And
may I just add one other thing, just sort of to connect with your last question before we go? One of the things that I think people might be interested in here is where all this information and where all this research is going to end up.
Good question.
And some of it, of course, is going to be published in academic journals that probably only academics will read, and that's just fine. But more importantly, it's going to be made publicly accessible. There's a website that has been developed. I'm busy sort of trying to populate it with all of the documents that we have found. It will be publicly accessible. And I aim for it to actually be bilingual as well in English and Punjabi by the time it gets completed.
Do you have a URL for it already?
We do, but it is not live yet. It hasn't been released yet. And I will be sort of announcing that and where people can find it when it does get released. And I'll tell you where you can find it in just a minute. The other thing that is going to be built is a public history exhibit that can be used in various locations throughout the province that will showcase the history of Sikhs. So public education, public accessibility is really crucial for this project.
So Michael, when you do get a URL for that and a link, can you send it to us so we can post it on the Sikh Foundation website and make it accessible to everyone who's might be watching this, who wants to follow up on what you're doing and to get access to some of this materials?
Absolutely, and some of these materials I have made public. For those of you who are on Facebook, of all things, there's a group called the Alberta Sikh History Project. And there I've been sort of showing some of the interesting finds that we've come across, talking about the project, talking about progress. So that's where I'll certainly be posting the URL once it goes live. And people are free to join that group on Facebook. And it's
what's it called again? The Alberta Sikh History Project. What's it called again?
Yeah, the Alberta Sikh History Project.
Okay, so go on Facebook, ignore the pictures of bouncing cats, and go and type in Alberta Sikh History Project.
Yeah.
And they'll be able to find the Facebook page that has a lot of these links already. So
yeah.
we can do that right now.
You can do that right now. Yep, absolutely.
Alberta Sikh History Project.
Yeah.
Got it.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, well, thank you, Michael. This has really been wonderful. So again, as I said before, we're so impressed with everything you're doing. You're a real pioneer. And we want to thank you for this enriching discussion about another aspect of Sikh history.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Great. Bye-bye. And we'll see all the rest of you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.